The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
Psalm 90 would say that, the only way to gain wisdom is to practice the ability to number your days, to know that they are numbered. They're not, limitless. But I think the other thing that Psalm 90, for example, is setting up for us is it's our limitedness against the backdrop of God's everlastingness. And so if we really are people of the kingdom, I can believe that God's going to get his work done. And he's whatever he wills, he has the power and the time to do. And so insofar as I'm a part of that, hooray, I'm thankful for that, because I think that is the dignity for which human beings were created. But I don't have to stress about the fact that the kingdom of God rests on my efforts.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. I'm always glad when there's a new Jen Pollock Michel book in the world. Her latest is In Good Time, 8 Habits for Reimagining Productivity, Resisting Hurry, and Practicing Peace. As we look ahead to a new year with all its goals and resolutions, Jen's thoughts on productivity, fruitfulness, and time are especially helpful. Jen Pollock Michel, I'm so glad to have you on the Habit Podcast today for our first episode of Season 5 for 2023, the first episode of 2023. So welcome to the Habit Podcast.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's great to talk to you again.
I'm excited about your new book, In Good Time. I felt it was very appropriate for a New Year's episode. Now, you're going to have to help me with this subtitle. It's kind of a long subtitle. In Good Time is the title, and the subtitle is
8 Habits for Reimagining Productivity, Resisting Hurry, and Practicing Peace.
Okay. Reimagining productivity. I love that idea. I think it's super important as people think about the new year. I think it's really important to reimagine productivity and what it's for. Well, what do you mean when you say reimagine productivity? In what ways will you reimagine it?
Well, in some ways, I feel like we do have to recover a better category than productivity. I think a more biblical category would be fruitfulness. So I want to make that argument for sure in the book, because productivity is asking really one question and one question alone. It's how can I get more done in less time? More and more done in less and less time. And it's interesting to look at the history of productivity. You really see that it is it's a measure that emerges out of the factory. As people look at how they can just produce more widgets in less and less time. And of course, it was applied to machines. It was also applied to men. The Bethlehem Steel Factory, they were kind of looking at like, how could we get more men to, carry more weight in a day? And some of that was eliminating waste, like of motion, figuring out, like the bricklayer. This is not Bethlehem Steel Company, but this is Lillian and Frank Gilbreth did a lot of like time motion analyses. So it was like the bricklayer. How can we get him to actually like lay more bricks in a day? Well, we can create scaffolding so he doesn't have to, reach so far to actually get his bricks. And so there's a lot of like work on eliminating motion. And those aren't, I don't think that it's a bad thing to figure out how we can work better and work more strategically. But when you think about productivity and as it has emerged out of the factory, and then you apply it to human bodies that don't work like machines, then you're in trouble. And I think fruitfulness is a better category because it actually allows for seasonality. It allows you to think about winters, think about seasons of dormancy, because, you don't produce fruit all year round, generally. So I think that's a category that applies better to bodies.
Yeah. Yeah. You draw a distinction between, help me if I'm getting this right, mechanistic time and body time, or machine time and body time. What's the language?
Yeah, mechanical time and body time. And before we jumped on, you said that you wanted to talk about crypt time. And I think this is a great place to introduce this idea of crypt time, which is a category of time, or I guess a measure of time that disability scholars talk about. So it's this idea that, you can't really measure the time any particular task takes, because different bodies will perform that task in different periods of time. So that if I'm a child, my body is I'll take longer to tie my shoes. And if I'm an elderly person, the same is true. If my body has certain, differing abilities, I might move more slowly through the world. I might move more quickly too. It just depends on our bodies. And I think the thing with productivity is that we standardize time and we don't allow for the differences of our bodies. And I think this is particularly difficult for people who struggle with illness, who have a chronic illness. I think it's difficult for people who have differing abilities. They are measured against a standard that feels very objective. And so they must be doing it wrong if they move more slowly or take more time to do something. And we don't value people who take time in the world, who move through the world more slowly. And I think particularly as Christians, believing that bodies are good and that God made each of us very different. I think that's why it's particularly important for us as Christians to think about different ways of keeping time, measuring time, valuing time beyond just productivity and moving through the world quickly with as much efficiency as possible.
Yeah. I love that reframing to say, not how long a task takes, but how long a body takes. Instead of, the idea that we conform, the whole idea of conforming to, as you said, that some objective, and I might say arbitrary notion of what, how long something is supposed to take. And especially for people who do creative work, we get these ideas that, we should be able to accomplish a certain amount of, for crying out loud, there's NaNoWriMo, National Novel Writing Month. Well, here's the month where we're all going to write, 50,000 words. And I said I was going to do, NaNoWriMo last month I guess this is December, so it was last month. And I think I wrote, 750 words instead of 50,000. It wasn't my finest hour in terms of productivity. But the productivity, as you said, that's interesting. It comes out of the industrial age, and efficiency. That word efficiency is a word for physics, right? It's for machines.
Absolutely.
We it's really interesting, and this is such an important part of your argument, that we willingly dehumanize ourselves when we say, I'm going to conform to, these expectations, the language of productivity and efficiency, which is not entirely unuseful language, of course. But I love the way you talk about being called out of Egypt. When the Israelites were called out of Egypt, they were being called out of a situation in which they were treated as machines or as tools to something else. So I'd love to say a little more about that, Jen.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's really interesting to situate productivity in the story of Egyptian slavery, because when you actually read the narrative in the Bible, it's very much like Pharaoh's like, you're not going to get straw. But you're going to have to make the same amount of bricks. Like your worth, your performance is measured on the amount of bricks that you make. Don't care what the conditions are. Don't care, what you actually need to get that done. That's the standard. And it is so interesting, isn't it? That for as dehumanizing as slavery was, Israel was constantly pining for Egypt. Yeah. When you read the wilderness narratives, it's like, can't we just go back? Yeah. So much of it was about the food, of course. It was a very selective memory. Like, I just remember the melons and the leeks. I remember what we ate for dinner. They didn't, selectively, I guess they sort of, excised slavery from the account, from the memory account. But I do think that productivity is very dehumanizing. I think it makes us feel as if we're not doing it right, life being it, when we have to move more slowly through the world. I think even like here would be an example. I suffered early losses in my life. My brother died when I was just out of college. My dad died when I was in college. And I never had a sense in those seasons of grief, like, of course, it makes sense you're going to move more slowly through the world. Maybe this is the time. Maybe this is a fitting time to take a little bit off of your course schedule in college when I was grieving my dad's death, or when I was a new teacher and my brother died. And, I remember being asked to take on more responsibilities. Of course, I was like in my first couple of years of teaching. And it was that idea that if you don't take on these responsibilities, like you don't have tenure, you're not guaranteed a job here. And so you always just fear. I think productivity is a lot built on fear. Fear that if I slow down, like I'm going to fall behind, I'm going to get left behind. I'm not going to get that next opportunity in my career. Or, most of it is, I would have to say, pretty career oriented. And I think that's the other thing about productivity is that it tends to be very individualistic. It tends to sort of forget about like how we're embedded and enfolded in human relationships, because really the only way that you can get more productive is if you can eliminate more contingencies in your life. And you think about all the contingencies of your life, they're generally related to either A, your own, bodily kind of wellness, B, your relationships. Those are the contingencies, right? And so the ways that you can get more productive and get more done is just to isolate yourself more and more. I think about even just this little thing that I ordered online because of course, it's the end of December and, we've been ordering a lot of stuff I hate to say it, from Amazon, but yes, I have too. And, I remember one thing came with this little note that said, time is scarce, be selfish with yours. I thought, no, that is like the absolute wrong attitude. But that's productivity does give you, it just reinforces every day, time is scarce. And somehow you've got to master it. You've got to exercise this unique time savvy. I just think there's a lot wrong with that. And I think a lot that we wake up every day kind of moving past life rather than actually living it.
Are you suggesting that time is not scarce?
I think it's a paradox. I mean, and you're
Mhm.
probably, anybody who knows my work knows that that's an important category for me. So I look at, on the one hand, 100% time is scarce. We're mortal beings.
Mhm.
Psalm 90 would say that, the only way to gain wisdom is to practice the ability to number your days, to know that they are numbered. They're not, limitless. But I think the other thing that Psalm 90, for example, is setting up for us is it's our limitedness against the backdrop of God's everlastingness.
Mhm.
And so if we really are people of the kingdom, seeking first the kingdom of heaven, this kingdom that will have no end, then I actually can believe in time plenty too. I can believe that God's going to get his work done. And he's whatever he wills, he has the power and the time to do. And so insofar as I'm a part of that, hooray, I'm thankful for that, because I think that is the dignity for which human beings were created. But I don't have to stress about the fact that the kingdom of God rests on my efforts. It doesn't, my name will most likely be forgotten. But that's not the name that we honor when all of time sort of expands into that everlasting kingdom. So yeah, time is scarce. I'm not going to get as much done. Not everything's going to get checked off the proverbial list. But I don't have to feel afraid of that. I think that's that's the invitation beyond time scarcity.
My friend Pete Peterson talks about the idea that, sometimes he thinks out of these projects I want to do that I'm not going to get done before I die. And yet, if we are headed for the new heavens and the new earth, we do have time to do all those projects.
Right.
And more.
I may learn ancient Greek after all.
That's right. In light of these, you've mentioned Psalm 90, numbering our days. Another phrase from Scripture that gets, dare I use the word co-opted, is redeeming the time.
Yeah.
And one of my guests last year, now I can't remember which one it was, sort of helped me just revisit that language, which to me is meant you better be efficient, you better be productive, you've only got so much time. What do you think redeeming the time means in light of the thinking you've been doing and the writing you've been doing? What does it mean beyond productivity?
Well, we're getting into the weeds here with language, which I think in so many ways, we bring our own particular experiences and understanding to language. It's not like language just sort of exists as this objective thing. So redeem is just, it's a biblical word. But I think we bring a lot of commodity sort of measures to it, because you think about redeeming a slave, you buy it back. And so I think as soon as we start to assign, and I'm not saying that that's necessarily what that I'm sure that's part of what the biblical writers were thinking, but we as industrialized people, think mostly about time as commodity, something that you waste, you spend, you save, you invest. And I think that is pretty unhelpful language because it actually makes it feel like time is at our kind of disposal to do with what we please. So I guess the first thing that I would say, and I guess I'm going to just kind of circle around your question a teeny bit, because I don't exactly know what the biblical writer means by redeem, but here are some, as I put together kind of an imaginative landscape from the Bible, I think one of the things that could be helpful, verbs we assign to what do we do with our time? Well, first of all, we receive it. And that was the second habit in the book. It's just this idea that you're not meant to control time or manage time. See, again, to go to productivity, you always think I have to manage my time. Well, is time at your disposal in that way? what about thinking about receiving time?
Mm.
I think that's far more helpful. And then I think observing time is another important category, like monks and nuns, the way that they move through the world. And not that we all have to sort of imitate, a cloistered contemplative life, but I think it's helpful to think about, there are certain times, and Christians do this in the calendar. We observe certain time in certain seasons of the year. And we don't come to those times just because we feel like it, right? We don't come to Advent because we feel like waiting, but we observe waiting time because that is we find that fitting. And that to me, so receiving time, observing time, inhabiting time, where we think about time acting like space, physical space. And Paul says that in Acts 17, he says, God's appointed the boundaries of your life, but also the seasons of your life. So you're almost inhabiting time as God has given it to you and assigned it to you as seasons of time. So if someone were to say, you have to define redeeming the time, I would say, I think that means receiving time as a gift from God and living in faithful response to his voice in time. And sometimes that, most importantly, I think that means you have to discern vocational questions and you have to identify kind of the fitting opportunities of your particular season.
Great. Thank you. That was helpful.
I don't know. I'm not sure.
Okay. Can you, by way of, I guess maybe summation is the word I'm looking for, talk to me about what are some ways we move from productivity to fruitfulness? I mean, that's kind of what, I guess that's what the whole book is, but talk to me about that. Just to sort of congeal some of the big ideas that you've been talking about.
Okay. So productivity, again, we think about it as related to efficiency a lot. You want to eliminate waste in your life. And one of the habits is actually waiting. And we think of, when you're in a productivity mindset, waiting is always waste. It's pretty much either wasted or it's definitely inopportune. It's something to be avoided. And so moving to a fruitful mentality means you embrace seasons of waiting. Okay. You believe that God is doing something good in your seasons of waiting. You think about what happens to the vine in the winter. It's not bearing fruit, but it's strengthening its roots system. So that's an important thing when you're waiting, is to actually believe that something is happening. And I want to say believe something productive is happening, but I only mean that in the sense of like the plant producing fruit. God's going to produce fruit in your life. That's something that he's already promised. It brings him glory, John 15. So you don't have to be worried if you're in a season of waiting. Waiting could look like you're in a degree program, you're ready to get out in the world and like produce something, publish something, do something measurable or visible, but you're actually just in a period of preparation. And so I think you got to embrace that period of preparation and don't hurry it along. I think fruitfulness is also about reckoning with tasks that take time. Productivity is always about like, how fast can I do something and how fast can I do it to get more done? Well, what kind of tasks do you take up? A fruitful life would ask you to take up tasks of love that take time. And so one of the stories that, this whole book is in the backdrop of moving from Toronto back to the States in order to care for my mother, who was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. Actually, after the book was published, or I should say written, I knew that she was not well, but we didn't have the official diagnosis until August. So a person who's dedicated to fruitfulness will commit themselves to tasks that take time, that actually don't produce anything like really measurable. I mean, when I go and help my mom, yesterday I took her to get her hair cut. And I thought, I mean, there's nothing like impressive about that. It's just kind of a caretaking activity that I'm taking up because I believe that God calls me to the work of love. Love takes time. I think that, people think sometimes it can be hurried, and I just don't know anything in a life of love that can be hurried. A good friendship is not something to hurry. A good marriage, the work of parenting, the work of loving your neighbor well, of caring for your places and your cities. Like, these things take time. So recognizing, I guess, a productivity mindset is resistant to tasks that demand time, effort, exertion, and kind of confront. Productivity always wants your ease and your convenience and effortlessness, because as long as you have those things, you're moving through the world quickly.
Yeah.
So how do you take up things that take time? I think a lot of spiritual habits move us out of productivity if we embrace them. With it beyond like just I'm getting something done, I'm checking this off my list. I talk in the book about just a new prayer practice for me, returning to a very ancient practice of the church, which is to pray at certain hours of the day. And again, the monks and the nuns observe time in this way. Like, they don't just pray because the work is finished. They pray because it's time for prayer. Yeah. And it's interesting when you take up a practice like that, how it interrupts your own sense of like internal urgency. That's what happened to me as I took up that practice. I'm fine with morning prayer. Like, I've had that habit for many, many years. But ask me to pray like midday, and I'm like, I got things to do. Yeah. And, even and I struggle with, I have to be honest, like, evening prayer is very hard for me, mostly because I'm super tired. But it was that midday prayer that interrupted my like drive for like getting more done. Like, no, you take your foot off the gas pedal here in the middle of the day. I use a particular prayer guide that often the midday prayer is like, perfect the work that I've already done imperfectly and help me finish the tasks that, are ahead. Like, it's just recognizing this is just not all resting on your work. Yeah. And so that would also call to mind practices like Sabbath are super helpful to reorienting our relationship. A lot of people think about Sabbath as a practice of rest, but we have to remember it reorients our relationship to work. And so, yeah, rhythms of rest are huge for moving into a fruitfulness mentality, because you can step off the gas, to pray in the middle of the day, to take a day off a week, to take a season of vacation a year, and know, He is God. And ultimately it's His work that's, keeping the world in motion. Yeah.
Let's talk about some of the habits. So the first part of this book, you talk about a lot of the issues we've been talking about here: time anxiety, moving, just reorienting our way of thinking about productivity and time. And then in the second part of the book, you talk about 8 habits for reorienting. And actually, could you list off those 8 habits?
Sure. Probably going to have to look at my list here too, so I remember all of them. Begin, receive, belong, offer, wait, practice, enjoy, and remember.
I'd like to talk about, depending on how much time we have, how long it takes to talk about some of those habits. I so appreciated the things you had to say about beginning. Because in a linear, if we think about time as strictly linear, you have a beginning and then you have a middle, you have an end. And if you botch the beginning, everything's off track.
You're done.
But as you make the case that Scripture reassures us that we begin and then we begin again and then we begin again, and that beginning is we don't just have beginning, middle, and end. We have new beginnings. So I'd love to hear you say more about that.
Yeah. I mean, that's the hope chapter, really. I mean, I think when we think about just our time anxiety, so much of it is related to things that we feel like are finished and done and, never to be redeemed. To think about that word redeeming, that what can God do with something that feels like it is very finally ended? And I grapple with that in the chapter because I'm talking about, again, my own stories of grief. I'm talking about, things that have even gone wrong with some of my children, in parenting, where you feel like that, I've made these mistakes and we're never going to, what new thing can emerge out of this story that seems already to have been written in our lives and in our family's life. But I just think as a Christian, to believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ and who in scripture is actually called the beginning. Like he is an incarnate beginning. He's a first fruits of more beginnings to come and an eternal beginning that's never going to end, right? When you think about the New Jerusalem, the new heavens and the new earth, like the sun is never going to set, like it will begin. And like that, the beginning just stretches out endlessly. And so I think there's a lot of hope in that for people who think that, something has ended. I made this mistake. I have this shame, this regret that is never to be overcome. And I just want to call them to hope. I want to call them to believe in the God whose mercies are new every day. And I also think that there's a participation aspect in that, like where hope isn't just something that, you feel, but I talk about N.T. Wright, a quote from him, and he says, it's a virtue. It's something you practice. You practice it like a tricky tennis shot. And I love that because it reminds me that there is a certain degree of consent and participation that I have in this work of hope, like that hope could actually have some sort of element of work to it. And I know that makes people nervous. We are good. So many of us are like good Protestants, who want to emphasize the grace of God. And I don't want to de-emphasize or decenter the grace of God. I just think these things are, again, very paradoxical. Like the grace of God meets us and we consent to its work in our lives, to God's work in us. So yeah, beginning is like, I love what I'm doing in that story. One of the stories I'm telling is even of just the birth of my twins. One of them got stuck. It was a C-section. The second one, obviously. And, him coming out emerging and being tangled in the umbilical cord. And, just that being a picture of the tangles of life and just thinking, no, there's got to be a beginning in here somewhere. And every morning, if we woke up and thought, in my marriage, in my parenting, in my, work, in this fractured relationship with an extended family member, there's got to be a beginning in here somewhere. And maybe not in this life. I don't think we always get a beginning in this life, but we could practice the hope of looking for it.
Yeah, that's so good. I said we were going to hit as many habits as we could, but I've got another question. I'm going to interrupt our kicking down the habits because this is my chance to hopefully understand something that I've had a really hard time grasping, and that is this language that you use that is not even close to original to you, because I've heard it all my adult life, and but still don't get it. The difference between Kairos time and Chronos time. Which does seem relevant too. I think this is a segue from the idea of beginning.
Yeah.
So help me understand. There's Chronos time that we're all very familiar with, and then there's Kairos time that's different.
Yeah. Well, of course, I knew that I was going to have to deal with this because, like you, anything that I've read about time usually makes this distinction and makes, I would say, often, if anybody can think about where they've read about Kairos versus Chronos time, it seems like Kairos is the better kind of time,
Right.
and Chronos is like the secondary, second string kind of time. Like we have to live in Chronos, but,
Yeah.
and interestingly enough, so I just took out my biblical resources and was like, what Greek words are used where in the New Testament? And you cannot make a case for that based on the words as they're used in the New Testament. You can't say Chronos time is bad and Kairos time is good. You can't even say that, Kairos time is the time in which God is acting, and Chronos time is like earthly time where, it's just the hustle and bustle of earthly life. The incarnation.
I'm sorry, Jen. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Maybe we need to define the two before we launch
Sure.
too deep into this conversation. So,
yeah. Chronos time is, we can just think about the word chronology, chronological. Chronos time is the time that we measure.
Mhm.
And so it really is we've measured time for millennia, not always to the, zeptosecond as now exist. But we've measured hours, with sundials and water clocks and, those kinds of things. So Chronos time is measurable time. And of course, we ended up with the mechanical clock, incidentally, from the monks in Benedictine monasteries. And so it's just the time that you can actually objectively measure. Kairos time is time that exists. It's time that's not measurable. People would say it's time that is about opportunity, time that is sort of intimates an eternal scope, time that is fitting, time that is, opportune, I think is probably the best way.
Okay. So here's where my problem is. I don't understand how that's time, right? To me, time is what what's measured out to us in coffee spoons, Elliot said. And so for me, it's like you've either got time or you've got some sort of eternity that is beyond time. And Kairos is what I'm not like. If it's not measurable, if it's not how is it time if it's not seconds ticking past? So maybe you can help me.
Yeah. Well, I think it's time as related to story. I think Kairos time imagines that there's some sort of story being written in time. And so, there's almost there are fitting moments in which, if you take a larger scope, if something happens in a particular moment, it's a kairotic moment where this is fitting for some larger story that's happening. Charles Taylor actually talks about a little bit in A Secular Age, so that, the medieval peoples, for example, when they would celebrate the festivals, they were entering into a story of time, maybe it could be pagan festivals even, this idea that there's more to just my day-to-day life. This the daily grind, I'm plowing my fields, I'm harvesting them, or I'm, doing the 9 to 5 in 21st century America. Kairos time was that time you observed in festivals and in celebrations where you sort of stepped away from your work and you entered into a sense of something larger is happening in the world. And what he talks about, and I think it's really helpful, and you could definitely go back to it, is he says, what's happened basically around 1500, from 500 to 1500, we had, pretty much collectively as a society, we acknowledged there was this other kind of time. And what happens as we become secularized is not just that we stop believing in God, but we actually stop even acknowledging some time beyond ordinary time. Chronos time being kind of that ordinary time, one day marching one after another, so that now all you live for is your day-to-day thing. Of course, Taylor talks about he would use the word cross-pressured. We feel a longing for the transcendent. we do feel a longing for a time that exists beyond this 24/7. Because a lot of us understand that what is involved in Chronos time is change and suffering. You know, you have to suffer Chronos time, because that means if the clock is ticking, the time is running out. And so we can't bear that as humans. Like, we do have a longing for some time that exists beyond this life. I mean, actually, so interesting when you think about, and I don't know if I'm saying this word right, but I was just recently doing some research on, is it cryogenics, like where people deep freeze their bodies?
It's cryogenics, I think.
Cryogenics. Yeah. Cryogenics. Okay, thank you. What did you say again?
Cryogenics.
Cryogenics.
Yeah.
Cryogenics. I can see it in my mind. I don't know why I can't pronounce it. But anyways, this whole, like, gosh, if you think about like this longing for something, or just where we can't bear the sentence of Chronos time, the sentence of our own mortality, that people are going to pay like $200,000 plus to deep freeze their bodies so that they can, maybe science is going to catch up and going to be able to reanimate them. This is craziness. Like, so, but it's because we don't have a sense of Kairos time anymore. We don't know any kind of story to tell about time beyond the 24/7. So the way that I think of it, so I have to say that I read an article fairly recently, within the last 6 months, where someone was making the argument that I felt really could not be supported by scripture, that, basically like Chronos time is like that second string time. It's the time that we have to live, but, really we should all be living, our lives with more Kairos, I guess, I don't know, a Kairos mindset. Well, I think Chronos time is a gift that God, it's part of creation. God actually marked out days. He gave us evenings and he gave us mornings, and he said that this was good. And so Chronos time is a good. It's a fallen good now. Like every other gift of creation, it is fallen. And we suffer like the ways that we only know it in its bruised and kind of broken form. But God entered Chronos time. And so I think that, I don't know the timekeeping exactly in heaven, but I think my life on earth right now, I think of it as I'm meant to sort of acknowledge Kairos as like the largest context of time, and Chronos time existing within it. And I do think that this is what this particular author, because of this article that I mentioned, we had an email exchange over a period of weeks where he was like, I think that's the argument I'm trying to make. I'm like, well, I'm in favor of that, where I can live my 24/7 in light of a larger story. But if I'm not rejecting the idea that I live a mortal life and that hours exist and days exist. But I'm asking maybe a different set of questions. See, productivity is just Chronos time, 100%. How can I make this day, this hour, this minute, work for the goals of my mortal life? Where Kairos time is like, if it is asking questions of like, what really matters for this particular moment, for this greater story in which I'm living.
Yeah, you kind of mentioned offhand that the mechanical clock was invented for keeping track of prayer times for monks and nuns. And that seems like a good picture of what you're talking about, right? That Chronos time.
Yes.
There's an example of redeeming time, right? Slowing down, using the clock as a way to say, oh, it's time to slow down. It's time to not be productive for this part of the day, and remember that God is going to complete this imperfect work that I've been doing. And it was news to me that the mechanical clock was invented for that purpose. And it feels like it's such the story of Western civilization, that the clock was invented for this purpose, and now it's turned us into machines.
Yeah. Yeah. Lewis Mumford, I think, Techniques of Civilization is the one. He's got this great quote about basically timekeeping became time serving.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, it's said even better than that. He has like a list of like 4 things, what timekeeping has become kind of time saving. But at the end of the road, it's time serving, where we serve time rather than time just being one more gift we receive and offer back to God.
It's the story of every kind of idolatry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I want to go back to Egypt, and even the memory of the food in Egypt is still, if I can be more productive, if I can go back, I can get. I mean, one reason I want to be more productive is so I can eat better.
Right. Exactly. So I can live more, nicer, whatever. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting though. I think we don't always ask those questions. Like we kind of stop at like, of course, productivity is good. Why would I not want to be productive? But it's like, productive for what purpose? Yeah. Productive for what purpose? I think is probably a pretty important question that a lot of us forget to ask, me included.
Yeah. All right, Jen, I'm going to ask you my question that I always ask at the end of these conversations. I forgot to warn you, so hopefully you can do this off the top of your head. Who are the writers who make you want to write?
Oh, yes. Okay. Is it fair if I say Dante? Just
Sure,
because I'm reading him right now, and I'm reading him for my MFA, so it's not like I'm just necessarily reading him for fun. But another writer had said how much she enjoyed getting through the Divine Comedy. And like Dante does make me want to write. He has the whole goal of the comedy is like to recover a sense of like the true practice of love, to love God, and to order every other love behind that. And a lot of things that he is doing in the comedy is he's correcting the way that what we look at, because our loves are formed by what we see in the image that we sort of take into ourselves by that vision. And I think the comedy is incredibly masterful. Of course, I mean, everybody's thought that for many, many centuries. And I even think like it sort of relates to one of the habits in the book, which is about offering things to God. When you think about the comedy and the extravagant offering that was, like, it makes me want to write like that. It makes me want to labor over something, to craft it so beautifully. And then, it might mean that it might mean you're Marilyn Robinson and you write 4 novels or, a collection of essays. Because there's not it may not be the most productive thing. So that's an older writer who makes me want to write today as like a living author. Well, actually she's dead too.
Living author is not one of the requirements. It's just,
okay.
Yeah.
I always forget. I think it's Anne Porter. Do you know this poet, Anne Porter? We should look it up too. I always want to say Catherine Porter, but I think that she was Anne Porter.
Anne Porter.
Okay, so I think it's just Anne Porter.
Yeah,
she is. I have her book of poems, Living Things. She was married to a painter, and they had a crazy busy household, 5 kids, and lots of hospitality that they practiced, and she just wrote these really beautiful, simple poems. So when I read, and the way that she connects, I guess, to concrete life is something that I appreciate about poetry too. So yeah, I guess I'll say those two.
Well, thank you. And thank you for being here, Jen. Your book is so helpful, and it's especially this time of year as we think about what this next year is going to look like. I love being able to step back and think about and reimagine productivity. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jonathan.
This podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. And all our podcasts are made possible by the generous support of our members. To learn more about us, visit rabbitroom.com. And to become a member, rabbitroom.com/donate.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.